Worse. Joining us now is Christopher Hill. He's a four-time ambassador, most recently serving as U.S. ambassador to Iraq. He's also the dean at the University of Denver. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start by talking about the sanctions imposed by the U.S. State Department this morning. Will Russia take this kind of visa ban seriously, you think?
Well, I think, frankly, these sanctions imposed by the U.S. really have to do with it's more of a Washington story. The administration wants to get out ahead of the Congress. Otherwise, the Congress will get out ahead of the United States, ahead of the administration. I don't think these sanctions will have much of an effect on the way the Russians really think about it. I don't think they're coercive in the sense that the Russians will hit the side of the head with the palm of their hand and say, oh boy, we better change our ways. So I think it's more punitive, and it's more an effort to show the U.S. isn't just sitting there, U.S. is doing something. I think the real action, though, is on the diplomatic side right now.
How so? What do you think needs to be done there, and what do you think can be accomplished there on the diplomatic side?
Well, clearly there are a couple of things going. First of all, the European Union is looking at putting together this pretty big package for Ukraine. Secondly, the Ukrainians have to kind of come up with a government that's perceived as more inclusive, that is, that does involve the eastern parts of the country, that do imply that they understand that Ukraine is not just Western Ukraine. And so they have a lot to do there. And I think it's important that the U.S. Secretary of State not be perceived as only talking to the Russians, that is over the head of the Ukrainians, which is why this whole secondary piece of trying to get the Ukrainians to talk directly to the Russians, or trying to get the Russians to talk directly to the Ukrainians, is quite critical. And then we have this little time bomb ticking away, which is the idea that Crimea will then, sometime in a few days, really, 10 days, will try to have a referendum, which will apparently try to join Russia. And that's not helpful to anybody right now.
Mr. Ambassador, let me put you on hold for 1 sec, because Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel is talking right now before the House Armed Services Committee. We're going to take that live.
We are also focused on reaffirming our commitments to allies in Central and Eastern Europe. I strongly support these efforts, the way it is being handled, the steps the President has taken to apply both the diplomatic and economic pressure on Russia, and the continued collaboration, coordination with our European partners. This includes the new visa restrictions and an executive order authorizing sanctions that the White House announced this morning. Earlier this week, as you know, I directed the Department of Defense to suspend all military-to-military engagements and exercises with Russia. And yesterday, I announced a series of steps that we'll take to reinforce allies in Central and Eastern Europe during this crisis. These include stepping up our joint training through our aviation detachment in Poland, and I was advised this morning that that continues to move forward. I visited Poland a few weeks ago, and we are going to augment our participation in NATO's ballistic air policing mission, and was advised this morning that we have six F-16s that have arrived in Latvia as of the last 24 hours.
That's Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel testifying before the House Armed Services Committee. Let's go back to Ambassador Christopher Hill to get his reaction to this crisis. Sir, I'm sorry for interrupting. We were talking before we cut to the live coverage of Defense Secretary Hagel about the referendum in Crimea that will allow the parliament there to vote on whether or not the citizens of Crimea want to become a Russian federation. What can you tell us about that, and how much do you think that could complicate the situation?
Well, clearly it'll complicate the situation. I mean, your reporter on the scene, Elise Labat, was talking about the fact that at the end of the day, probably we'll have a situation that kind of looks like the status quo, that is with a Russian presence in Crimea, but a Crimea that is nominally administered by the Ukraine. So if this referendum were to try to change that, that would be, I think, problematic, because you would have a situation where there are fewer of these if I can say, pro-Russian voters in Ukraine, with the result that Ukraine will continue to kind of move westward, which is not what the Russians want to see. So for a lot of reasons, I don't think anyone is really interested in this vote happening, and so probably there'll be some effort to say it's non-binding, that it's an expression of the will of the people, but not one that will be turned into any kind of change on the actual map. So already we've heard the Ukrainians saying that this is an illegal vote. Probably it'll simply be a vote that does not have legal consequences of some kind, but that it will be allowed to go on. So probably they'll try to diffuse it in that sense. I do believe the Russians are kind of beginning to look for a way out of this. I'm not sure international civilian monitors is a dog that's going to hunt in this, but nonetheless, I think there does need to be real stepping up of the diplomacy, and I think that's what's happening as we speak.
You think this is ultimately going to end somewhat like it did in 2008, where Putin ultimately, in 2008, he went into Georgia and seized control of two breakaway republics, went into Georgia a little bit more, then withdrew, kept the two republics, and that's the status quo. The world expressed outrage, then ultimately just forgot about it and moved on. Is that situation going to repeat itself here with Crimea?
Well, you know, that sounds kind of uninspiring, but yes, and it's probably the best outcome we can expect here. You know, I don't think we want to, go into some huge, full-blown crisis with Russia. You do kind of wonder how this present generation of leaders would have handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, which finally went out with in a way that I think protected everybody's interests, even though it wasn't the most dramatic way of ending. That is, we ended up pulling some systems out of Turkey at the time. So I think if we can get there to what you describe, I don't think it's such a terrible ending for what has been a real problem. I think Russia needs to be thinking about its own internal problems and how it can move westward, how it can join up with international systems. Clearly, Putin is not taking the country in the right direction in terms of its democracy, but we can continue to work with them, at least get their economy moved westward, and eventually maybe their democracy will move along in that direction as well. So I think, we have to be very careful about all the testosterone that gets spent up in, starting these things and figuring out how we can finish them.